Hello and welcome back to LA Legal with Liana and Nima. And today we have yet another very special guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself and let our viewers know what you do, what firm you represent, and then we'll get started.
Thank you. My name's Eliot Houman. I am the co-founding attorney of a law firm called the Accident Guys, where we specialize in work injuries and car accidents.
Elliot's actually a very good friend of mine. So happy to have him on the show. First time here on the podcast, but really a good friend of mine since college. So
Thank you. I'm glad to be here,
Yeah, we
guys.
heard the story before you came in. You guys went to you were in, what is it, PSEC?
Yeah, that's right.
Together. So very nice. All right, well, let's get started. Yet another serial killer, this time a woman. So
how
let's
does
talk.
that feel?
Honestly, considering I'm a serial killer junkie, I'd never even heard of this woman. So,
Yes, women are underrepresented in the law
Yeah.
and clearly in
and
the
in the
serial killer
world.
genre as well.
Yeah. I mean, look, I thought this was really interesting for many, many reasons. So let's get into it and then we'll talk about it. So Aileen Wuornos was born February 29th in 1956 in Michigan. She had an older brother, Keith, who was 2 years older than her. Her mother abandoned them when Aileen was only 4 years old. Dad was incarcerated, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and later sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. He committed suicide while in prison. Eileen's mother left the two kids with the grandparents, who at some point down the line ended up adopting the kids. Aileen was abused by her grandfather, both sexually and physically, and at 14 years old, she was kicked out of the home and left to fend for herself. So really, really crappy childhood, right? And so we kind of talked about this, I think, in a past podcast. I don't remember about who, but sort of this idea of like nurture, right? And like where some people, like what happens in their life that leads them to eventually commit heinous crimes like this. So do you think this is like the makings of a serial killer, having a childhood like this, right? Where you're constantly abused, you're thrown out of the house, no mom, no dad, no money, no food, nothing. And you turn to, you know, stealing and prostituting yourself at 14 years old for money. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the whole nature versus nurture thing, we've talked about it on previous shows, right? You know, we're going back to, the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, or coming even to today, Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter also in Florida. And then you have sort of like what you would see maybe like a normal type person, like a Brian Koberger there in Idaho that has mental health issues. I mean, I really think it's both. Some of it is mental health related, which can be genetic. I mean, she's diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, kind of like Amber Heard, by the way, your favorite person. But a lot of it's the nurture. I mean, she's someone who was reportedly raped at a very young age 14. She got pregnant, was forced to give up the child for adoption. Family members with significant history of alcoholism. So, I don't really know what the answer is. I think it's a combination of both. But, Elliot, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I definitely think her background and what she went through did not help her situation. Whatever mental health issues she had, it was definitely compounded
You're
by
right.
that terrible. She was homeless for a long time, kicked out of her home. I even read that her older brother, who's 2 years older than her, would have sex with her regularly. And people in the community started learning about this, and she kind of became shunned. She was a pariah. Even her own family rejected her. And so all those things compounded on top of one on top of the other, just created a recipe for disaster, I think.
I think it kind of shows sort of like a hatred towards men, right? Because the people left in charge of her is like her brother, her grandfather's friend, I read somewhere, was also abusing her when he found out that the grandfather's doing it. So there's all these like older men, right, who are supposed to take care of her. She doesn't have mom, dad, and they're abusing her, right? So they're doing the opposite. And so I think that kind of contributed to, if there was mental illness, to the sort of like deep hatred for men, which is why she targeted them ultimately. So
Isn't the irony though that her lesbian lover was the one who turned on her ultimately? Really, the only
Right.
person that she
Even-
trusted,
right.
the person that she tried to protect, right?
right. So even her, yeah, exactly. So this is really someone who had nobody in the world, which I think, and we kind of talked about this briefly before you came in, Nima, that like, I think this is why a lot of people felt bad for her and still do, when you read some of the comments, when you read discussion boards and things like that, people really do feel really, really bad for her. I mean, granted, we haven't even gotten to the brutal killings, but just this life, right, of a child, really, and what she's had to endure.
Definitely. I felt bad for her as I was reading about her and learning more about her. Even after the murders, she was being abused. Abused by her lawyers in some ways, abused by the police in a lot of ways, even abused by her close friend, like you mentioned. It was just a very sad story all around.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit, right? We're jumping back and forth a little, but you know, again, this is someone who's constantly at every stage in her life being taken advantage of, and so you know, she. Let's talk about the trial a little bit. Nima,
Sure.
take it away, and then we can kind of talk about everything that happened post, right? Her attorney, she gets adopted by these people who everyone's exploiting her for money. So let's talk about the trial.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the trial, but I mean, the exploitation is real. You know, I don't want to gloss over it. I mean, everyone's trying to make a buck off her and sell her story to Hollywood, and ultimately it is made into, you know,
movie.
a big movie, an Academy Award-winning movie. So, you know, there's all these murders. The state seeks the death penalty, but there's really only one that goes to trial. It's sort of kind of like a bellwether case you would see, and then.
Can you explain that? I think that was really interesting how, you know, so there's seven murders. One of them, the body's never found, but they ultimately convicted or took her to trial for just the one. So explain why they chose.
Yeah, so they chose to. I mean, you're talking about some victims who are not sympathetic, right? They were Johns. Some of them arguably weren't, right? They were trying to help her out. So there's all these stories, right? You know, she attracts men because she wants clients and she's a prostitute. She tries to reportedly rob others by coming up with a story of this sort of her car breaking down. Her story does really shift over time, but the state starts with one case, one death penalty case, and you know, and we're talking about sympathetic victims here. You know, women are rarely executed in this country. Rarely. Even in our personal injury cases and employment cases, women tend to be better clients. Juries like women. I mean, that's just the reality. So, you know, prosecutors, they don't like to lose. And, you know, they rarely seek the death penalty, but this was a rare death penalty case involving a woman. But the really kind of key fact is, you know, they focused on one case that they thought was a particularly good case because the defense argued self-defense, right? So a case where the prosecution thought that it was just a straight robbery, that the victim was shot in the back multiple times. But, you know, even though it focused on one victim, and this kind of goes back to kind of our, you know, 404B and prior bad acts and the bar, and there's a Williams case there in Florida, but really the state brought these evidence of all these other murders to show that she wasn't really acting in self-defense. It was really kind of a big issue on appeal. So even though the case involved one victim, all these other murders came in with these prior bad acts witness. So
how did they get that stuff introduced if she was never convicted for those murders?
Well, it just goes to kind of that mimic evidence, if you recall, like motive, intent, you know, lack of mistake, really to negate self-defense. So it's very controversial, but basically when she argued self-defense, the state said, well, that opened the door to bring in all this other uncharged evidence in to show that, no, this wasn't self-defense. This was your MO. This is how
because it's like, okay, 1 time, 2 times, 3 7 times, you know, this happens to you, and all 7 times it's self-defense. So, right? Is that sort of
that's
what they
basically
kind of
it. Yeah, I mean, you rob these victims, you have their goods and, you know, some storage facility. You know, this wasn't self-defense. This was part of your plan to rob and kill these men.
Right. Well, it's also the victims were, you know, older, white, rich, you know, so there was also like a specific type of male victim that she's targeting, right? Sorry for interrupting,
but if there was never an adjudication or a jury said that, yeah, you committed those prior bad acts, they're just speculating that she's connected to those bad acts.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's up to a jury. You know, and the judge said this kind of goes to the weight of the evidence, not admissibility. I mean, the jurors can determine whether
to believe it or not.
Yeah, to believe it or not. But I mean, look, it's one of those big evidence questions, right? You know, and we see this a lot in. Now we see it a lot in sexual assault cases, right? You know, sort of the Bill Cosby's, Harvey Weinsteins of the world, right? When they're prosecuted, there might be like one or two victims, and there's all these other women who say, "Hey, he also did it to me." It's not charged conduct, but it comes in as a sort of prior
Well,
bad
they
acts.
also have a voluntary confession,
Well,
did
yeah,
she? So,
Yeah.
yeah, big. Well, the public defender came, said, "Don't talk to the police." She did. The story shifted over time, and really, it wasn't a self-defense story, at least out the
yeah.
gate.
Well, let's talk about how they got that confession, right? Because the girlfriend who you mentioned, Tyria Moore, she agreed. So she took an immunity deal. She agreed to get wired up, and so she told her girlfriend, "You need to come clean and just do it soon." And that's ultimately how they got it. So,
Yeah, she's a rat. She's a snitch, and she turned on her girlfriend.
Yeah.
And so not only do you have those incriminating statements, during, you know, so they lean on the girlfriend, right? Get her to cooperate, give her that deal, and then when they arrest her and bring her in, they tell her, listen, they basically get her to confess to kind of exonerate and free her girlfriend, and that's one of the reasons she does so against the advice of her attorney. So, the cops leaned on her. I mean, the confession was deemed knowing, voluntary waiver, the Miranda rights, all that good stuff from criminal procedure. So it all came in, and I think the reason the jury convicted, even though you have a woman who's still a victim, a prostitute, right? A victim of being sex trafficked and so forth. Were I think the three reasons were: one, that shifting story over time, right? She didn't say that she killed him to prevent herself from being raped, right? First it was, an argument over money that he wasn't going to pay me, right? So that's one, kind of the changing story. The second is the robberies, right? I mean, stealing from all the victims, having that property, I think was bad. And then the third was sort of that pattern, right? Same gun, same sort of MO. You really need to use self-defense. And again, I'm not saying, this is someone that reportedly had sex with many, many men every day. But you needed to, use deadly force to save yourself 7 times. I think that was hard for the jury to accept.
In a matter of 1 or 2 years when these murders took place.
right. Well, it's also the manner too. I mean, most, if not all of these victims were shot multiple. I mean, she really, it wasn't like, okay, one fatal shot. Even after they were dead, I think again, if it's not all of them, then most of these victims, they were shot multiple times, and, not even fatal shots, right? I mean, they were already dead. She really, that's what I'm saying. You could tell that she just hates men. And so I'm not surprised all of this was sort of brought in. But interestingly, her and her girlfriend, Tyria, were initially identified because they rolled over in one of the cars that she had stolen from her victims. So there was eyewitness reports, right? The police officers were trying to figure out, okay, well, who is this connected? Are all of these sort of victims turning up dead? What's going on? And so their car rolls over, somebody identifies them, and that's how sort of the ball gets rolling on how they get caught. And so they had an undercover, I think it was an undercover officer who found her in a bar, kind of lured her in. And I watched his interview this morning, and he was like, I told the police officers to stay outside because I was not about to take her to a motel room and be the next victim.
Yeah, and her fingerprint was in the car,
Oh yeah, and then the fingerprint. So ultimately, the car that she stole was really what got her caught.
Let me ask you a quick question. Maybe you guys know. So I know it was 12-0. The jury convicted her 12-0. Does it have to be unanimous if you're going to find somebody guilty, or can it be 11-1, 10-2?
Yeah, it is unanimous. So it has to be 12-0 jury verdict for the guilt phase. But the death penalty, the Supreme Court has ruled that also, because there was a couple states that didn't have a unanimous jury requirement for a death sentence. The Supreme Court said that it has to be unanimous. So going back to kind of Nicholas Cruz, the recent Parkland school shooter, it was just a small handful of jurors. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 that didn't want to oppose the death penalty. So he got a life sentence. So it's got to be unanimous as well for a death sentence. So
what I want you to talk about, Nima, is the multiple life sentences that she got, right? She got like 5 life sentences. So talk to us about that, because ultimately she just pled no contest after. So explain that to our viewers, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's multiple victims. She could have gotten, multiple death sentences. And after that first trial, she essentially gave up, right? So she went through the guilt phase. She was convicted. Then they went through the sentencing phase, and the jurors have to weigh the aggravating and mitigating factors. I think it was like 5-1. There was some mitigation, obviously, alcoholism and upbringing and that type of thing. But it was really kind of, the cold, premeditated nature of the killings, the multiple victims. I mean, those were all aggravating factors. But, she had the opportunity to move forward with other trials, and she just chose not to. And we saw a little bit with Jeffrey Dahmer too. They just, she just gave up. She pled guilty, or basically no contest. And even with respect to her appeals, I mean, they did appeal her conviction, but she didn't pursue it as aggressively as some other defendants on death row. And, she was sentenced to death relatively quickly as far as death row inmates are concerned.
Do you think it's due to ineffectiveness of counsel at that point? Or do you think it's just she herself was, sort of done with it?
I think it was more herself. I mean, this is someone that wouldn't listen to her lawyers, right? Even from the beginning, I mean, basically, I'm saying we learned that's like law school 101. Even if you go on like social media, it's like, don't talk to the police when you're arrested. Now, sometimes people that choose to do so, they think they can, outsmart law enforcement, but they don't realize anything you say can only hurt you. But it's sort of rare when you have a lawyer there telling you don't talk to the police, and you don't listen to your lawyer's advice and you do it anyway. So,
in a way, I think towards the end, especially, she wanted to die. She fired her lawyers who were still trying to appeal for her. She was continuing to admit over and over again, recant her self-defense testimony towards the end, saying, no, I did it. I want to die. And I think at one point she was mentioning how terrible she's being treated in prison, and she just doesn't want to subject herself to that for the rest of her life.
I mean, if you really think about it, like, what kind of life is that, right? I mean, it's not like she had an even okay life to say, let me, appeal and maybe get out. Like, what is she getting out to, right? Everyone she's ever known has betrayed her, has abused her. It seems like that's what was happening in prison. I mean, I don't know. I don't sort of blame her for just saying, you know what, I'm done with this. I mean, what kind of life is that for anybody?
Yeah, it seems she's had multiple suicides in her family. I'm surprised that, again, you don't want to be grim, but given how terrible her life was, that, she wanted to continue living.
And I think that's why, as we mentioned earlier, that's why people feel really badly for her. And I mean, look, it doesn't, for me, there's never justification from having a crummy life to, okay, now you're a serial killer killing people. That's not what I'm saying. But when you take that aspect of it away, I mean, I get it. Like, it's really sad. This is someone who literally just existed, kind of went through the motions, became a really crappy person, and then was ultimately executed. Like,
it puts it into context. I think a lot of times you learn about serial killers and you're always like, why? You want some type of understanding. Maybe it's just the human mind. You want to comprehend why it happened. And in this case, I mean, the why is all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the recurring theme, obviously, we've seen a lot. I mean, we've talked about a lot of serial killers. It's the sort of physical and sexual abuse.
Season 2, guys, season 2.
Yeah. It's very common. It can be whatever, Richard Ramirez. It can be anyone, I mean, these are people who were abused as children and adults, and it's just that cycle of violence that continues.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Right.
She had one way out, was when she married that rich yacht owner when he was 69.
Oh, that's right, the 60-something-year-old. And she was abusing him too.
Yeah, and then she started beating him with his cane, and that could have been her one way out.
Right. I mean, that's what she's seen, though, right? I mean, her grandpa would beat her with, like, belt buckles at 4 years old. I don't understand any of it, right? I can't imagine. Sorry. I can't imagine beating a child. I can't imagine being someone who sees that growing up, right? Like, she's never felt love. She's never been nurtured, right? Like, no mom, no dad, crazy grandparents. I mean, it's insane.
We talk about mom, right? I mean, we talk about dad in prison, but I mean, you're a mom, you're a dad. Mom abandoned her, right? Left her, so.
Very sad.
It's very, very sad. Another fun fact that I read this morning, she was actually the second woman to date to be executed in Florida.
Okay.
Only the second. So it goes to your...
Casey Anthony. Maybe should have been the third.
She should have. She's one freaking person I don't feel bad about.
And Jeb Bush could not wait to have executed her. It was like he just wanted to push that button as fast as he could.
Right. Well, you know what else? I mean, so this is something I like to do before these podcasts is I'll go back and I'll actually watch the interviews of the sort of serial killers because they're just so fascinating. And when she was asked about, being becoming known as the damsel of death or whatnot, and she was like, "Well, I just shot them. What's the big deal? I didn't like chop off their penises and do anything else to them. What's the big deal?" So that disassociation of what you've done, right? You've shot people sometimes in the back or whatever multiple times. And she's like, "I just shot them. Like, what's the big deal? Why am I so different than any of the other men?" What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, why are we even talking about her if she didn't torture her victims like the rest of the serial
Yeah,
killers?
I mean,
know?
she
Yeah.
just shot them, but there was,
I mean,
and
she's
she's
clearly a
very,
B-list serial killer. You know?
she was very coherent. She was actually very well spoken, which made me think of, oh my gosh, I'll forget her name right now. The girl who killed her boyfriend in Texas, the Mormon. She's not a serial killer. Oh my gosh, it's gonna drive me crazy. Can somebody, Noah, please put a little text bubble? Let's come back to this. But there was another girl who was. Oh my God, I'm gonna go crazy. She killed her Mormon boyfriend. She stabbed him like 39 times, decapitated him. Nima, come on.
Are you talking about, isn't it Texas?
Jodi
Oh, she's in
Arias.
Arizona.
Oh,
wasn't she?
Arizona. What?
Wasn't it Arizona?
I thought it was Texas, but she was like that too. Like she
Fact
was
check,
so
Jodi Arias.
Yeah,
Jodi Arias.
Jodi Arias.
And it is in Arizona.
Arizona.
Oh.
Okay, there's Nima with the Snapple
I
fact.
know.
But
Yeah.
she just really reminded me of her, So she was so cold and so so.
Well,
what?
Jodi Arias, because obviously I do court TV every week with her attorney, Kirk Nurmi, who's a great guy. He saved her life, and she didn't get a death sentence. So.
Right.
Was she abused sexually or physically, Jodi Arias?
She was not. Oh, God, I love when we go off on tangents. She was not, but she was a very, very jealous girlfriend, ex-girlfriend. So I don't think she had any history of abuse. Maybe we should do another segment on this. But anyway, point is that Aileen Wuornos reminded me of her because she was very well spoken. She was very intentional with what she was saying. There was none of this sort of she's not sane, she's not all there. She was 100% there. She was 100% stood behind what she was saying in all of her interviews. And she was also deemed
Mentally fit.
to be
killed.
executed too. So there was, I think, a stay at one point, and they deemed her, 3 different psychologists deemed her.
She was
Mentally
not
fit
crazy,
to be
crazy.
executed.
You can see kind of her manic
Yeah.
side sometimes, but then sometimes she'd just be very coherent, and you can really be like, this girl has a brain.
Oh, one other thing that I think is interesting that I read, for the life of me, I won't remember, but there was a group who had filed a stay of execution on her behalf. Can you talk about how that happens, right? Can somebody else, file a petition to stay someone's execution on?
Yeah, you can file what we call sort of amicus briefs or friend of the court, that type of thing. Ultimately, it's really kind of a question of standing. Do you have standing to intervene in a case like that? Sometimes the courts will seek those types of briefs if it's a novel legal issue. There weren't any particularly novel legal issues in this case. So once she gave up, that was really it. But one thing we should talk about is one thing that was interesting in this case, you don't typically see, it's not really appropriate, is when you have law enforcement, you have lawyers trying to sell the story.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, obviously, the lawyers, there's ethical considerations, law enforcement as well. I mean, that's not a good look at all.
No.
Well, law enforcement, their defense was that they were going to deposit the money into a victims fund. Did you guys hear that? That's what they were like. Well, we weren't doing it for us. It was for the victims.
I don't think that's still a legal justification. I gotta,
I don't think it is,
Yeah.
but that was
You
the
can't do something
story.
unethical and then give the money to charity. I don't think that makes it okay.
No, but I think that was a BS sort of cop out. What do
So
you
what
think?
are the rules? You see all these movies made about crime, and I'm sure they interview the police. What's allowed and what's not allowed?
Yeah, so lawyers, we know, obviously have the duty of confidentiality. You're supposed to represent your client as a former prosecutor. You're very limited in what you can say publicly. You certainly can't do anything that may prejudice the trial. When you're no longer working for the government, some of those limits may be restricted, but certainly you can't do anything that may affect the case while the case is ongoing, whether it's a trial or the appeal. Obviously, I've never been a police officer. I assume there's sort of similar rules that govern their conduct as well. You can't be profiting off the case, and you certainly can't do anything that may affect the case.
Can we talk about the parents who adopted her? I know we mentioned them briefly, but they were also making money off her too, right? So all of these, like, she's in prison, she very limited access to her, and then her adoptive mom, who was like 10 years older than her, who claims that Jesus came to her and said, "You need to save her," is now like making demands 10,000, 20,000 per interview, and so she's out here milking the system. I mean, how sad is that? But also,
It's sad.
so
but
insane.
Can you blame them too? You know, they're probably super poor, and they
Yeah,
were
she was
given
like
this
breeding
opportunity.
show horses or something. I think they were
Maybe
a
that's
couple that like lived on a farm and were breeding horses. But you know, it's almost like the blind leading the blind in the situation. Like, no matter how you look at it, everyone surrounding this woman is either trying to take advantage of her, is abusing her. Very sad story all around, no matter how you look at it. And so there's actually a movie on this. I found out earlier. Charlize Theron, did you know that that's
Well, our crack videographer Noah told me. So,
yeah.
you know.
Oh, he told you too?
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked it up. So I will be watching that tonight, actually.
The
It seems very Monster, yes. So that's apparently how Charlize Theron got her
Oh yeah.
start.
Yeah, it was like her big break. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, final thoughts on this very interesting topic.
You know, I was sick to my stomach learning about this, especially as a father, just seeing how, you know, how formative, how you do some things wrong when your kids grow up. They can really grow up to be really messed up. And I was just, you know, I felt bad for the victims. I felt bad for her. I felt bad for the system. It was just all around. One thing I did learn is that the most requested meal by people who are on death row is KFC, which is what she ordered also.
Is it really?
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't love fried chicken? But
I mean, as a last meal. Have you guys ever thought what yours would be?
Oh yeah, I actually said it today. Okay,
What was
literally, I was at a lunch with someone,
Let's
and it
hear
just
it.
happened to be where I'm going tonight. So I'm going to it's a restaurant downtown LA. It's called Bestia.
Oh.
And I said
Is it
the bone marrow.
bone
bone
marrow.
marrow?
I said it's the bone marrow pasta.
Okay, Bouge.
Yeah.
So, a little fun fact: when I first started working here many moons ago, Alan, your
Yeah.
partner, asked me one day. He was like, "Gun to your head, what's your last meal if you're on death row?" And I was like, I don't know, pizza. But I didn't know like bone marrow was on the menu. I
That
was
won't
like,
be allowed
pizza
in
would
prison.
be-
The options are probably KFC or pizza.
Yeah.
Yeah, so pizza would be mine, I guess.
Really?
What's
I
yours?
would honestly, I would say KFC.
Really? Jeez. I remember fried popcorn chicken or something. I don't think I've had it since high school. But okay, well, there's your little advertisement for KFC, for the Monster movie. I mean, we've talked about it all. Thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you for being here today. I hope you
It was my
enjoyed
pleasure.
your
Thank you
first
guys for having
podcast.
me.
Elliot, thanks for being here. Looking forward to having you again. Another
I would love
episode.
that. Thank you guys.
And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.